All right, good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to this, the fourth or penultimate lecture of the 2022 Dante Public Lecture Series. And today we are really experimenting with our laptops and with being in a room and being physically together in presenza. This is the first time since Catherine Keen's lecture back in 2020 that we've actually had people together in a room for one of these Dante lectures. And I'm delighted to say our guinea pig for this evening is Professor John Barnes, who has come all the way down from Dublin on the train with Judy to give our lecture this evening. And for us, it's a particularly nice thing that it's John that is doing this, because anyone who has worked in Ireland or indeed in the UK or indeed internationally, they all know John. John very much is really our kind of leader when it comes to things Dante. And John, when he took over in UCD and became the professor of Italian studies there, led the way in Dante studies for years, running the for many decades, the very successful UCD Dante Public Lecture Series, which many people present here today online gave lectures at that wonderful series, which was sadly discontinued then on his retirement. But John has been a kind of an indefatigable producer of wonderful studies on Dante. He's been a great supporter of younger up-and-coming Dantisti, and he's still very active. And just among his many publications, I just want to mention Word and Drama in Dante, essays on the Divina Commedia that he did with Jennifer Petrie. Then there's also Dante in the Middle Ages, literary and historical essays that he did with Cormac O'Quillinon. Dante and his literary precursors with Jennifer Petrie again, and that wonderful Dante and the Human Body again with Jennifer. And these are wonderful publications. I myself had the great fortune to kind of learn from John. We co-edited with him, and I should really say he did the majority of the heavy lifting. War and Peace in Dante in 2015, and then the final volume of that kind of series, Dante and the Seven Deadly Sins. And it was a genuine pleasure for me to learn from John in this process. Besides these wonderful publications, he has written numerous essays on Dante and also on Pirandello. And it's a real treat to have him here with us this evening. The title of his lecture this evening is I Have a Little List, an approach to Dante's Catalogue. So I'm just going to start off the presentation for John, and he'll take it away from there. So sorry, that's at the end there. Let me just get to the beginning. There, John, te la parola.
Well, I'm very grateful to Dara for this extremely generous introduction, but I have to tell you it's far too generous, not to say undeserved. I'm not a great Dante scholar. In fact, I'm not a great scholar at all. A great scholar is one who devotes himself for years or even a whole career to a single question or a coherent set of questions to which answers will benefit the scholarly community, and produces an authoritative, durable solution, typically embodied in at least one monograph and or a string of interrelated articles in respected scholarly journals. I've never done much that resembled that, and I've never produced a monograph, partly because I've never tackled a specific problem for long enough, or deeply enough, or indeed both. When I was just a lecturer, my professor took my wife on one side at a reception and said, "You really must persuade John to concentrate on building up a single solid body of work rather than spreading his energies more thinly over different unrelated projects." He was aware that I would happily write about Pirandello or one or two other 20th century authors, as well as various medieval writers, including Dante, when my central focus was supposed to be on medieval Florentine chronicles. I'm afraid his advice was never really taken. I've done some decent work, I think, but never in a sustained way, exploring topics chosen to satisfy my own curiosity rather than for the greater good of the scholarly community. I had the luck to belong to a generation in which this was possible. Someone was recently kind enough to acknowledge me publicly as the founding father of studies on Dante and the Christian liturgy, a field which has become very fashionable since the essay I published in 1995, though certainly not solely because of that essay, if at all. But of course, I never followed that up with further work in the same area. Often my choice of topic has been due to circumstances, such as the theme of a book or a conference to which I've been invited to contribute. Thus, to look no further than Dante, I've occasionally written about the lyric poetry or the Fiore, and connected the poet with earlier chroniclers or contemporary painters, or the Casentino area, or warfare, or the image of the horse, or the Della Scala family of Verona, or the seven deadly sins. What I've enjoyed most is close reading of passages of the Commedia, episodes such as those surrounding Morello Malaspina, Matella, or the Candida Rosa of the Empyrean, or readings of cantos, including Inferno 8, 9, 13, 23, Purgatorio 20, 28, Paradiso 27, for example. In a word, lists are just one of my latest fads, stimulated by a conference in Lithuania about Dante's aesthetics. Since I'm no philosopher, I thought of studying the aesthetics of Dante's lists, which probably wasn't wholly within the spirit of the conference, but did give me a chance of a trip to Vilnius. In the event, serves me right really, the conference was first postponed and then cancelled thanks to the coronavirus. But by then, the embryonic idea had grown sturdy legs. I don't expect in the future to be seen as the founding father of lists in Dante studies, though in 2 years working on them on and off, I haven't become aware of any predecessors. I just think there's a chance this work may prove interesting to others and perhaps add something to the way we understand Dante as a writer. So what about lists? In the first place, I use the term list and the term catalogue as synonyms. Not all authorities do that, making instead subtle distinctions between them, but for my purposes, I don't see any reason to do that. The catalogue has had a well-established place as a set piece throughout the course of Western literature, since its very beginnings with Hesiod and Homer. A particularly famous example being the Catalogue of Ships in Book 2 of the Iliad. Plenty of splendid examples are provided by writers such as Virgil, Ovid, Lucan, and Statius, while Macrobius, in his 5th century Saturnalia, is one of those who discuss the catalogue from the point of view of the literary critic, comparing Virgil's specimens with Homer's. And the history of the device may be followed through writers such as St. Augustine into the Middle Ages, when it features prominently in the Roman de la Rose, for instance. Often it became a tour de force. Dante would have found a fine example in the Ars Versificatoria of Mathieu de Vendôme, where at one point, spring is characterized by a list of 16 birds whose songs beautify that season, plus 4 others whose songs do not. He would also have known Provençal Serventesi, accommodating conspicuous catalogues. Indeed, he tells us in Vita Nova that he himself wrote such a poem, not Provençal, but Italian, I suppose, in any case now lost if it's true, listing 60 of Florence's most beautiful ladies, in which, of course, Beatrice was number 9. So it's no surprise that we find lists reappearing in the Commedia. We all know what lists are. Deborah Schifrin, a specialist in discourse analysis, calls them descriptive structures that center on categories and category members. unless, I would add, they creatively subvert that characterization by juxtaposing such items as cabbages and kings. Schifrin goes on to call a list a realization of a descriptive category in which the cumulative presentation of category members, list items, instantiates the general category. Her words, not mine. The emphasis on the descriptive character of these structures is intended to show that lists are essentially non-narrative. They hold up the narrative, which could have continued without them. They'd none of them be missed. Whereas the basic units of narrative are events, the basic units of lists are entities, again, her terminology. The minimum number of entities that can form a list is 3, and occasionally literary scholars have thrown the spotlight on threefold lists in the texts that they've studied, but a commoner and more practical approach is to stick with lists of 4 or more items. Of these, in Dante's Commedia, there are, I think, 46. Of course, one can do a lot more with a literary list than count the items of which it consists. Obviously, one should view it in its context, considering how it serves that context, its purpose, and how it's framed. But much can be done with a list taken out of context too, with attention to its content, its structure, and its shape. What kind of items are listed? How long are they? And how are they ordered? How dense is the list? How many items per line or lines per item? Are there variations in its density? And if so, what's their effect? What are the literary or non-literary sources of the items and of any ancillary information? Is the list aesthetically pleasing? And here, of course, one can treat it like any other passage, taking account of such elements as register, tone, lexis, tropes, syntax, rhetoric, rhythm, meter, and rhyme, all the usual things, in fact. So let's start at the beginning, or close to the beginning. Apart from a list of 4 Virgilian heroes in Inferno 1, Camilla, Euryalus, Turnus, and Nisus in lines 107 and 108, the first qualifying catalogue in the Commedia is the list of patriarchs freed from limbo during Christ's harrowing of hell in Inferno 4. The poem's first 2 lists then are both lists of names. Although many other categories are represented in the world's literary lists, people's names are probably far commoner than anything else. In the Commedia, lists of personal or family names are more numerous than all the other lists put together. Here, if we include the periphrases il primo parente, which is Adam, and lo padre, which is Isaac, we have 9 names. But the catalogue's scope is extended not only by the addition of e molti altri. In jargon, this is an instance of occupatio, but also by the phrase coi suoi nati, at least Jacob's 12 sons, progenitors of Israel's 12 tribes, but also perhaps his only daughter, Dinah. Rhetorically, these nati constitute a 10th, although in order 9th, component of the catalogue, while the 10 components are contained within the space of 2 terzine. From this point of view, the densest line, containing no less than 3 items, is line 59. But that density doesn't preclude 2 markers of relationship, padre and nati. Abraham and David, together in a single line, are each allowed only 1 word of amplificatio, patriarca and re, while Abel enjoys the luxury of 2, it is a luxury, suo figlio, at the expense of Noah, who needs no qualification. But it's Moses who benefits from a moment of lesser density with legiste obediente. Both he and David are considerably promoted in respect of the chronological order. It would seem that the poet wished to give these 2, Moses and David, particular prominence, and that he took a particular interest in the only named woman, Rachel. I can't move it now. Oh. Yeah. Have we locked that as well? I want to go on to the next slide. Yeah. Thank you. Do I do this every time?
Yeah.
Is that the top thing? Yeah. Okay, this is Casadei for your information. According to Casadei, this passage, the one we had just now, would have been written before Dante was effectively exiled in 1302, so earlier than we've often thought. But it seems to me that this list is already a little masterpiece. Now, that catalogue forms part of a reply by Virgil to a request by the pilgrim for confirmation of Christ's descent into hell. And it concerns a category of souls who are actually no longer present in limbo. It serves to amplify the reply and to reinforce the confirmation with paradigmatic examples. Same canto accommodates a second catalogue with similar attributes, except that it's authorial rather than spoken by a character, while the souls named are physically present and thus part of the immediate narrative. Working for me. Oh, no, that is, got it. As with several of the Comedia's catalogues, these are a selection of the residents of a division of the other world. But this is the longest such list in the whole poem, with 35 components contained within the space of 24 lines. And I've managed to squeeze them all on there. I hope you can read. I think you can. Good. The passage seems vaguely modelled on Virgil's catalogue of the denizens of the Elysian fields in Aeneid 6, at the same time also showing affinities with the medieval Cervantese and with passages in popular didactic works such as L'Intelligenza. Much has been written about the choice of these spiriti magni and the order in which they appear, so I'll be brief about that. In fact, there isn't time this evening to deal exhaustively with any of the longer catalogues, especially if we get any more interruptions from here. Unlike Petrarch in his Triumphi, just the opposite, Dante is severely selective in the first part of this list, the first 8 lines, where 13 names stretch from the mother of Troy's founder, right at the beginning, via 2 supreme Trojan heroes, followed by heroes and heroines of Rome's growth to prominence, to the first consul of the Republic and the supposed founder of the empire, with the addition of 4 Roman exempla of female virtue, all in more or less chronological order, apart from the dramatic promotion of Caesar into the company of Hector and Aeneas. Except for the amplification sua filia for Lavinia, Caesar is also the only beneficiary of any scrap of characterization, armato con gli occhi grifani. After a Muslim exemplum of supreme public virtue, Saladin, we have 21 famous writers, still partially ordered chronologically, but also progressing from philosophers to medical men, mathematicians, and poets, to end again in the Muslim world, this time identifying 2 philosophers. This second part of the catalogue seems more expansive, not only because of the greater number of names, but also because of no less than 5 amplificaciones che il mondo a caso pone, echoed by che il gran commento feo, il buon accoglitor del quale, morale and geometra, which make the listing less dense, but more interesting, perhaps because the names were less well known to the average reader in Dante's day, as perhaps today as well. As in the earlier case of the redeemed patriarchs, here again there are indications that the list could have been longer, con molti compagni, tra filosofica famiglia. Very often, lists are structured by means of anaphora, identical beginnings. And here we have an excellent example of that, in that the introductory vidi appears no less than 9 times. From time to time, a name is replaced by a periphrasis, as in line 127 or 131 or 139, you can count behind the faces there. And if there were time, one could focus on other stylistic aspects and features such as synonymia, alliteration, verbal repetitions, metaphors, and a case of rhyming chiasmus in line 140, as well as analyzing the meter, the syntax, and an acceleration from Diogenes onwards. But we should certainly note, right in the middle of the passage, a very clear pause for a particular tribute to Aristotle, to whom 4 lines are devoted, while 3 verbs in the historic present, miran, fanno, and stanno, make him stand out even more. All in all, I find this an excellent catalogue, though the quality does decline a bit towards the end, where perhaps a loss of inspiration reflects a lesser familiarity on Dante's part with the individuals listed. That catalogue of 35 names, as if it weren't long enough, is in effect extended by a second list in Purgatorio 22, where Statius speaks to Virgil about other residents of Limbo. Here, the category isn't explicitly that of spiriti magni, but 9 writers of antiquity, poets and dramatists, are said to be con with Homer and Virgil in line 101, while 8 female characters from Statius's own poems are placed quivi. This quivi is puzzling. Does it just mean in hell, without specifying in qual vico? Or does it refer specifically to that noble castle in Limbo where the others are? If the latter, it contradicts Inferno 20, where Manto, la figlia di Teresia, has already been accounted for among the false prophets. Anyway, the catalogue thus consists of 17 items, or 19 if we include Homer and Virgil. And once again, its selectivity is indicated. Altri assai, altri piue, con le suore. It occupies a space of 18 hendecasyllables, but its density is extremely variable. 7 Latin components, if we count io and altri assai, are squeezed into the first 4 lines, which are followed by 5 lines of pure respite with no names. 4 Greek writers, e altri piue, then share 2 consecutive lines, and after a further 2 lines with no names, the last 5 lines accommodate the 8 ladies from Statius. At certain moments, then, the listing is extremely dense, but at times it's aerated by parenthetic insertions, nostro antico, si trista come fue, or by periphrases, quella che mostrò l'angia, la figlia di Teresia, while the Latins and the Greeks are separated into 2 groups by 2 lines of pure additional comment, lines 104 and 105. Again, I gloss over elements of adornment, such as further cases of periphrasis, antonomasia, metaphors, alliteration, anaphora, and verbal echoes. The introductory formulas are varied, as are the lengths of what they introduce. This list then also, and it's perhaps unique here, is ingeniously woven into the narrative flow, and more precisely into an exchange of direct speech. The first 4 names are part of a question by Statius, while the others constitute an amplification of Virgil's reply. The meter is very discreet, as befits a conversation between these 2 poets, and the syntax too is relatively simple, with the usual cheerful mixture of asyndeton and polysyndeton, and no multiple subordination, no subordination of subordinates, that is. This is a fine catalogue as long as it lists writers, but it becomes deficient when the 8 Greek ladies are added, even though they're presumably there to please Statius, and perhaps meant as a parallel to the 8 Roman ladies in Inferno 4, lines 121 to 128. The ambiguity of that quivi is one of the problems, while another is the fact that the poet doesn't seem to show any real interest in these unfortunate women. And is Thetis no longer a goddess? A goddess has no place in Limbo. And why is Deida mia there con le suore? Evidently only because they're mentioned once in passing by the historic Statius in line 296 of the first book of the Achilleid, Pulcrisque sororibus. The only reason I can think of anyway. In Dante's catalogues, the numerical ratio between items and lines occupied is extremely varied. One of the densest is the list of names of 10 malebranche in 2 terzine in Inferno 21, rolled off with consummate artistry as an integral part of Malacoda's orders. Needless to say, there's no room for attributes beyond sanuto and pazzo, partly because in this case, the names are unknown to the preceding cultural tradition. Here, not only the rapidity, but everything contributes to an effect of farce, also achieved through the sounds of the names themselves, particularly the harshness of numerous consonantal groups, an extraordinarily rich rhyme, and a whiff of Tuscan jargon. The repetitive rhythm reinforces the sense of barked out orders, even though the 2 terzine are identically terminated by an a minore hendecasyllable after 2 a maiore ones, while the parallelism continues with the pair avante oltre. The syntax is completely devoid of subordination. There's only one case of asyndeton, while all the other coordinations are made using and, a. The passage is governed by 3 imperatives, or yussive subjunctives, which have respectively 3 subjects, 1 subject, and 6 subjects. The word order is simplicity itself, as in everyday speech. The only added coloring comes with that initial expression, tratti. Overall, a perfectly formed catalogue. Another comparatively dense catalogue assembles not so much personal names as names of families in Paradiso 16. To be precise, 44 or 45 families of Cacciaguida's Florence, while hinting at even more. Con altri con esse comes after the list's end in line 148. Here, the consistency really oscillates between rara e densa. From the 11 items identified in the first 2 terzine and the 7 of lines 103, 104, and 105, to moments of relaxation, where the poet seems to want to focus the reader's attention on 2 houses of particular interest. The Adimari in lines 115 to 120, and the Ravignani in lines 94 to 99. And that's leaving aside the continuation of Cacciaguida's speech after the catalogue's end, where Dante's forebear returns to one of the houses already named, the Buondelmonti, for comments carrying heavy political baggage. The passage's uneven density also allows the inclusion of other polemical notes at the expense of at least 8 other families in lines 95 and 96, 105, 112 to 114, 134 to 135, and straight after that, 136 to 138. One may guess that the lingering over the ultracotata schiatta of the Adimari, overbearing and cruel with those who offer them no resistance, but servile towards those who oppose them or give them money, and to which Filippo Argenti may have belonged, is due to a particular hatred on Dante's part and desire for reprisal. According to Giovanni Villani, as early as 1280, era la briga between the Adimari and the Donati, with whom Dante was at least related by marriage and on friendly terms through Forese. Besides which, according to Benvenuto da Imola, a Boccaccio Adimari secured possession of Dante's property after his exile, and thereafter energetically opposed his readmission into the Florentine state. The case of the Ravignani is completely different. Their prominence in the text expresses the greatest respect for those who were the ancestors through Bellincionberti of the distinguished house of the Conti Guidi, and, it seems, of Dante himself, through his grandfather, Bellincione di Alaghiero. The function of this catalogue is to illustrate the growth and decay cycle of families and cities according to the movements of Fortune's wheel. That was made clear just before the list began in lines 67 to 87. It therefore has a four-part structure, grouping first houses already in decline in Cacciaguida's day, just in lines 88 to 90. Then families at their zenith, 91 to 99. Followed by those well advanced in their rise to eminence, lines 100 to 114, and those in the early stages of that rise, 115 to 139. The list is developed in a very flexible way. It opens with a triple anaphora on vidi, but more recent phases are dominated by the adverb già, which occurs 9 times and is itself found in anaphora in lines 101, 121 and 122. Every so often, the focus shifts from the families to some other center of attention, notably 2 of the city gates, one in line 94 and the other in line 125. Here and there, family names alternate with the formula quel di or quei di 4 times, or elsewhere with a form that seems to be a personal name, Galigaio, Caponsacco, Giuda, Infangato. 8 or 9 families, the Uccellini may or may not be included, unnamed, are represented by periphrases. The Pigli and the Lamberti are identified through a description of their coats of arms. And 6 houses related to each other, rather than being named, are bundled together and enveloped in a complex periphrasis, which again includes heraldic detail. That's in lines 127 to 132. The allusion to the Buon del Monte in line 135 is the most opaque of the lot, but is clarified and amplified as soon as the catalogue is closed. As would be expected in view of the speaker and the topic, the style of this catalogue is extremely elevated. So again, I'll gloss over the details. All in all, this is an ambitious catalogue and one crowned with considerable success. If that list of Florentine families is one of the densest, at least sporadically, a much more relaxed specimen is the list of frein, or exemplary cases of vice punished, to be meditated on by the penitent proud, which are described directly by Dante the poet in Purgatory 12. Together with the 3 images of humility carved on the rock wall and described in Canto 10, this is the first of the 7 sets of moral exempla, and as such is exemplary in a second sense. Within its 13 terzine, the list embraces 12 scenes carved on the rock floor. It's not only a catalogue, but also an ekphrasis. One is struck by the precise distribution of 1 scene per terzina, except for the second exemplum, which, shaped as a diptych, occupies 6 hendecasyllables. One is also struck by the regularity of the anaphoras, which, introducing the first 11 scenes, including both halves of the diptych, give us 4 times vedea, 4 times o, and 4 times mostrava, while the 3 lines of the last terzina and the final scene begin with those same 3 words. Such regularity is very much in keeping with the ritual aspect of Dante's Purgatory. From other points of view too, the structure is tightly controlled. In particular, Dante's syncretism requires that the 6 biblical scenes are in rigorous alternation with the 6 drawn from classical sources, while da un lato in line 27, followed by dall'altra parte in line 29, suggests that the Bible and the classical world are on opposite sides of the path. The first 3 examples, in effect, form a homogeneous group as archetypes of rebellion in their respective traditions. But according to Tartaro, the various attempts that have been made to organize the remaining examples into distinct categories of proud individual have achieved too little to be worthwhile. The fact remains, though, that Niobe, Arachne, and Eriphyle all thought themselves equal to a goddess, while Sennacherib, Rehoboam, and Cyrus all believed they could do whatever they pleased with impunity, like a certain politician. Formally, each anaphoric Vedea governs an infinitive. Each anaphoric o is followed by an exemplary sinner's name, with only folle intervening in the case of Arachne, while of the quartet of anaphoric Mostravas, 3 are followed, if not always immediately, by come. The meter is relatively unperturbed and the syntax is comparatively simple. On the other hand, plenty of space is available for variatio and creativity. For instance, while 9 of the exemplar are simply named, the first comes wrapped in periphrasis, the last one via synecdoche, and the 8th, Eriphyle, through a complex circumlocution involving her son Alcmeon and a necklace with impeccable divine connotations. What's added to the names is mostly no less allusive to details in the respective sources and offers a great variety of visual spectacle, but also psychological intuitions, quasi smarrito, occhi dolenti, trista, pien di spavento. In short, the whole passage is a splendid example of Dante's virtuosity. But once again, we can't savor all the detail here. Another low-density catalogue, but certainly not an ekphrastic one, is that of 16 unjust kings reigning in 1300, or in the case of Louis I of Navarre, a little later, whose sins will themselves be listed in the volume aperto, remembered from the Bible. The speaker this time is the eagle of the 6th heaven. We're in Paradiso 19. Contrary to what happened in the list of exemplars of pride, here only the first item is identified by name, unless we add the nickname Ciotto di Gerusalemme. Almost all the other monarchs are recognizable through periphrases, which typically include the name of the nation governed, twice a pair of principal cities, elsewhere the relationship to another king, or a detail about the ruler's accidental death, or even another periphrasis. In the case of the penultimate monarch, only the nation is specified, leaving the rest to the reader's intuition. This isn't one of Dante's more successful lists, evidently for the same reason as the Purgatorio list of residents in limbo. In its second half, the poet had to scrape the barrel of his exiguous knowledge. What, for instance, could he know about Norway? He didn't even know about the Winter Olympics. That explains the comparative poverty of his periphrases, quel di Spagna, quel di Boheme, quel di Portogallo, quel di Norvegia, quel di Russia. It's not surprising that the rhythm accelerates towards the end. I think both the poet and the reader are sort of think they've had enough in a way. At first, each king has the privilege of a terzina to himself, but already the 3rd and 4th terzine accommodate 2 kings each. The middle part of the catalogue is the most relaxed, if Ciotto occupies a whole terzina, and as many as 6 lines are devoted to Frederick II of Sicily. After that, though, the next 7 monarchs are packed into 2 terzine, and only at the end does the eagle relax the rhythm again, allowing 4 lines for Henry II of Cyprus. But the 2 kings who occupy the most space are also those about whom the eagle speaks most harshly. This catalogue shares with the one in Purgatorio 12 the technique of parallel anaphoras, 3 times lisi vedrà, 3 times vedrassi, and 3 times e, to kickstart the first 9 terzine. The site of that li is the aforementioned volume, which provides the central thread of much of the passage, from the penna used in it by the angelic scribe, through the I and the M he'll inscribe after the name of Charles the Lame, to the abbreviations he'll adopt to condense into a small space the many sins of Frederick II of Sicily, thus underlining his worthlessness. So far, so good. But the anaphora using E is weaker than the others, despite the link between opere in line 136 and the list's opening line, and despite a fresh burst of the initial energy in Li si conosceranno, while the motif of the register pales with a shift of viewpoint from writer to reader, paranno, si conosceranno. And the meter becomes monotonous. The two exclamations in lines 142 and 144, though already beyond the purview both of the anaphoras and of the book motif, could be considered an opportune concluding gesture, except that they don't conclude. Rather, they are followed by a substantial further item which aesthetically damages the catalogue, despite the power of the metaphor bestia and the harshness of the rhyme. Certainly, I've no wish to deny the passage's overall effectiveness. It maintains a magnificent tone of contempt and sarcasm via a riot of tropes, especially more periphrases, metonymies, and metaphors, seasoned by a skilled use of rhetorical devices and a good handful of harsh consonants. And it's noticeable that the kings of the British Isles, Spain, as well as Bohemia, and Sicily, explicitly represent the usual trio of fundamental vices, pride, lust, and avarice. But considered strictly as a catalogue, the passage is rather disappointing. Now let's go backwards by one canto. If the purgatorial list of ancient limbo dwellers was woven into both sides of a conversation between two characters, there's a catalogue in Paradiso 18, which, communicated directly by the poets to the reader, springs from the very action of the narrative. It's thus anything but static, unlike many of the other lists. Its 8 components are blessed souls perceived as points of red light, massed together with countless others against the background of the white Greek cross, which is the Señor of the heaven of Mars. And each of them, named in turn, moves quick as lightning, but rotating as it goes to another part of the cross. Cacciaguida, who is present as another point of red light, has already been named, and it would be tempting to include him as a 9th item in the list. But I can't quite justify that, which is a shame, because 9 is an inviting number, as it's the number of the 9 traditional 9 worthies. They were 3 heroes of antiquity, Hector, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, 3 Jews, and 3 Christians. Of these, assuming the 9 worthies are here the model, Dante obviously deems the heroes of antiquity unqualified, but retains the Jews, Joshua and Judas Maccabeus, saving David for the next heaven, Paradiso 20, and the Christians, Charlemagne and Godefroy de Bouillon, omitting King Arthur, who's mentioned only incidentally in the Commedia, Inferno 32:62. To those he adds, to complete his own band of 8 worthies, Robert Guiscard, Duke of Puglia and Calabria, together with 3 figures who are more or less legendary, as Hector had been in the traditional group: Roland, William of Orange, and Renoir. On this occasion, the chosen souls are all named in chronological order. Once again, the distribution of the names creates an acceleration. The first 2 occupy a terzina each, while the next terzina accommodates 2, and the last one 4. But since this catalogue is partly narrative, the first 6 lines also contain material that established the scene and the action, which is subsequently picked up more economically in Così and Poscia Trasse. The only element of amplificatio is the simile in line 45, made more effective by the chiasmus object, segue, subject, subject, segue, object. Otherwise, anything inessential is eliminated with several repetitions of key words. Even the names are introduced obliquely as causes of the soul's movements. It's an extremely compact passage. Quite dissimilar is the catalogue of the Romagnol aristocracy of the Buon Tempo Antico, which is part of the Plagne addressed to Dante by Guido del Duca in Purgatory 14. Dissimilar, firstly, in that it compresses 4 items into the opening 2 lines, thus reversing the acceleration pattern we've seen. But more interesting is the fact that it consists of 17 items chosen not from a single category, but from 3. Names of individuals, names of families, names of castles. Certainly such discontinuity is not without precedence. If Homer's Catalogue of Ships also juggles 3 points of data, the leader or leaders of each contingent, the places from which a contingent's troops are drawn, and the number of ships that brought them to Troy. But Dante couldn't know that. Where he could have encountered mixed catalogues was, for instance, at several points in Virgil's Eclogues. Here, the alternation is masterly. The first 9 names are those of individuals, the next 2 of families. Then there are 4 names of castles, followed by 1 more family name, and lastly, 1 more individual, giving the catalogue a chiastic circularity. But that scheme is intertwined with a structure based on syntax and shifting perspectives. The first 6 names are contained within rhetorical questions, introduced 1 by Ove and 2 by Quando. The following series of 5 names unfolds in a context of tearful remembrance. Bertinoro is apostrophized in a further rhetorical question. The other 3 castles are judged positively or negatively with open antithesis in the 3rd person. The Pagani are connected through anaphora with Bagnacavallo, metonymically the Conti Malvicini, but with a leap into the future. Ugolino dei Fantolini, the addressee of another apostrophe, is anaphorically linked with Bertinoro. The constant theme of any additional matter is that of Romagnoli tornati in bastardi, and the last 6 names are all associated with the idea of their extinction, which either has occurred or is desired. Right in the middle of the catalogue, under the aegis of the Anastagi, there's a mini list, Le donne e cavaliere, gli affanni e gli agi, rhetorically impeccable with double synonymia, alliteration, and chiasmus. Much more could be said about this magnificent catalogue, but you wouldn't thank me for keeping you here too long, so let's move on. As I said earlier, not all catalogues consist of people's names. In the Commedia, for example, one may think of the 4 rivers of hell, listed in Inferno 14, 116 to 119. The 4 reaches of the river Arno, in Purgatory 14, 43 to 54. The 4 cities of Flanders, all in one line, Purgatorio 20, 46. Or the 4 territories governed by Charles Martel in Paradiso 8, 58 to 75. I'd like to dwell briefly on the list of 5 snake species forming part of the fauna of the Libyan desert in Inferno 24. As is very well known, this lightning catalogue is part of a passage where the poet develops the topos of the vaunt, or the boast, what Curtius's English translator calls outdoing, where the superiority or even uniqueness of someone or something is established on the basis of a comparison with notable exemplars of the same kind. Here is the 7th Bolgia that outdoes the Libyan desert. But there's also an implicit rivalry between Dante and Lucan, who, in a famous passage of his Pharsalia, Book 9, set within a description of that inhospitable desert, explains the origin of the multiform and terrifying serpents which so greatly increase the danger. They were born in the sand from drops of Medusa's blood, which dripped from her severed head when Perseus flew over the area carrying it. Lucan's passage is a tour de force, so that Dante's competitiveness is particularly acute. In his 34 hexameters, Lucan assembles no less than 17 species of snake, almost all with rare exotic names, adding a succinct characterization of each. Dante's challenge follows the less is more principle, selecting 5 of those 17 reptiles and leaving all the accessory information aside. He chooses his specimens with care and then presents them in a new order. In the source, they're respectively the 4th, the 12th, the 13th, the 5th, and the 10th. Of course, he selects rich and strange nouns, phonically idiosyncratic, which he can fit into the meter and rhyme scheme. But even in this regard, he maximizes the difficulty of the contest by placing 2 of his 5 choices in rhyme. As if to effect nonchalance, the whole is relegated to a conditional clause, itself wrapped in a causal clause. Meanwhile, the perfectly regular meter flows smoothly thanks to the enjambement. The one verb governs 5 objects, of which 3 precede it and 2 follow. So the syntax is balanced and saves a mini surprise for when the 3 become 5. In short, a little gem. I think Lucan lost that one. Even abstract entities can be listed. Examples in Dante include the 4 questions that Adam says the pilgrim wishes to ask him in Paradiso 26, 109 to 114, or the 4 vocations, statesman, condottiere, priest, artisan, identified by Charles Martel in the persons of relevant archetypes, Paradiso 8, 124 to 126, or the 5 Romagnol cases of tyrannical rule mentioned by Dante Personaggio to Guido da Montefeltro in Inferno 27, 40 to 54, or the 12 symptoms of moral decay that distinguish contemporary Florence from that of Cacciaguida, Paradiso 15, 110 to 117. Here we'll have to make do with the catalogue of spectacles offered by military camps, which, enunciated directly by the poet, opens Canto 22 of Inferno. This passage forms part of a preamel, which is a rhetorical structure used to organize a particular kind of comparison. A preamel opens with a contrastive array of at least 2 relevant entities for the real term of the comparison, situated in the culminating position to stand out against and generally exceed. Except that Dante couldn't be aware of that because the technique was identified and named only in the early 20th century by eminent German scholars, which is why the term is stressed on the 2nd syllable. Das ist eine Preamel. If you want to learn more about preamels, I recommend the 1st chapter of this book by William Race. Here, the real term of the comparison, which comes after the list, in lines 10 to 12, is the extraordinary signal emitted by Barbariccia, and already, of course, specified at the close of the preceding canto. We're in the same farcical zone as the list of Malebranche's names. All is hustle and bustle and turmoil, as is already shown by the syntax. There's only one finite verb, vidi, though it is used 3 times. Clearly, the visual is all that matters. The basic list consists of 8 spectacles compressed into the first 2 terzine, while the 3rd terzina contains a secondary list depending on quando con and subdivided between 4 precise entities in lines 7 and 8 and 2 antithetical categories in line 9. There's barely a word that doesn't contribute to the animation. Talvolta and oaretini are the only exceptions. And of the 16 nouns, 12 refer directly to martial activity. The meter and rhetoric also enhance the effect of this parody of epic poetry and help to make it another masterpiece. I must just tell you about one more variation. Deborah Schifrin insists that the list and the narrative are hermetically sealed off from each other as distinct, non-overlapping, and indeed antithetical structures. She does allow, however, that a catalogue can list events in the form of complete sentences, thus seeming very much like a narrative, except that whereas events in a narrative are linked together through an evaluative structure, lists of events have a cumulative effect. In her words, events are added together as separate instances, and it is their accumulation itself that substantiates a generalization. A Dantesque case in point forms part of Justinian's speech in Paradiso 6, where the Blessed Emperor lists with multiple subdivisions 8 phases in the history of Rome embodied in the eagle. This is just the first part, 18 lines out of 60. The important point is that he does this not to tell the story. His addressee already knows it, as Justinian repeatedly acknowledges in lines 37, 40, and 43, tu sai, sai. His purpose is to demonstrate the sacred value of the Roman Emperor, the Roman Empire, the sacred value of the Roman Empire, as a springboard for his warning to Guelphs and Ghibellines that's going to come in lines 97 to 111, and was already promised in lines 31 to 33. We have here almost another preamble on a vast scale, not quite, but almost. The 8 components are naturally presented in chronological order. The first 2 and the last 2 are given just 1 terzina each. These are the pre-monarchic and monarchic periods of Rome and the periods of Titus and Charlemagne at the other end. The 4 intervening phases are developed at greater length, 4 terzine for the Republic, 6 for Julius Caesar, 3 for Augustus. But the culminating phase is the 6th, the redemption of mankind through Christ's sacrifice under Tiberius, which receives a very different treatment. The significance of that event is generously illuminated in a single 9-line sentence, where everything converges on the last 2 lines, 89 to 90. And if I had more time, I could show that's a very different syntactic structure from all the rest of the passage, with reason. I could say far more about this magnificent list, in fact, far more than any of the others I've burdened you with, but I restrain myself. By way of conclusion, I would observe that stylistically, as you'd expect, Dante's catalogues aren't very different from other parts of the Commedia, apart from an understandably more frequent occurrence of anaphora, perhaps. Everywhere in the Commedia, the style is highly changeable in accordance with subject matter, circumstances, and context. It's basically in their function and their organization that the lists have a character of their own. Almost half the catalogues with more than 3 components, especially in Inferno and Paradiso, list souls belonging to the various areas of the other world. There are also some lists of other individuals or families, especially in the 3rd Cantica. On the terraces of Purgatorio, certain catalogues list exempla with the function of ferza or frame. Almost all the catalogues are of the open type, potentially extensible by addition of further items, though there are occasional closed specimens consisting of a fixed series and all of it in its entirety, such as that of the 9 angelic orders and the corresponding circles of fire in Paradiso 28, or that of the books of the Bible, symbolically represented by the procession in the terrestrial paradise, Purgatorio 29. We encounter a great variety of cultural matrices, of categories providing a catalogue's components, of density with which the components are combined, of linguistic complexity, of rhetorical situation with a constant shifting of interlocutors between poet and characters. Often the catalogue is anything but inert in the sense that a flexible handling of ordering and spaces can transmit its own meaning. I've suggested that not all Dante's catalogues are wholly successful, but perhaps most of them are, so that our poet surely occupies a distinguished place in the long history of the literary catalogue. Thank you.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, John. That was really excellent. It was a comprehensive foray into what is a fascinating area. Now, with regard to questions, I'm just going to ask people to do one thing, because the sound on the computer that I'm using isn't great. I will allow you to ask questions, but could you also write them in the chat so we can see them as well, just in case we can't hear them. I'm just going to, as you're thinking about that or writing your questions into the chat, I'm just going to ask John one question myself. Come back over here, you don't run away. So so the first list that you showed from Limbo, and it ends in a really nice way, e altri molti, and as if say there is more. There is also that really famous list that you, I don't know, did you deliberately avoid it? But Canto 5, and it is this wonderfully varied list, but it's also a very incomplete list, you know, with the più di mille. And I'm interested in this kind of incompleteness of lists. How do you rate Canto 5's list of the lustful being buffeted around by the buferi infernal?
Well, oh, am I supposed to finish? Hello. It's a list that's very well known. That's part of the reason for not dealing with it. Also, I wanted a variety of lists, and I was already dealing with 2 from Inferno 4, so I wanted to go somewhere else, really. And I did. It's a long time since I looked carefully at that list, although I have done so. The incompleteness comes quite frequently, actually. I think it came in several of the ones that I talked about. It may just be a filler, of course, you know, the way of finishing off a index. Yeah. One always suspects these motives.
But it is a list that kind of veers towards the modern or the contemporary in Dante's time, to Tristan, to the medieval.
Absolutely, yes, that's right. I think in that case, it's also a way of saying, you know, lust is everywhere in the world. There are lots of, far more than I can possibly mention here, and far more you can even imagine, far more than we even know about.
Is it a successful list?
That one, I think it probably is, yes. I need to go and look at it again before I gave you a good answer about that.
All right, I'm going to open it up there now for people who want to. So we got one from Ted. So here we go. Just read this. So Ted asks, consistently more about the geographical list as a category besides those mentioned. This Inferno 2027 come to mind.
Well, I had to be selective. I mean, I think I make it 46 lists in the Commedia, and I didn't even mention half of them. I don't think, not even briefly. I knew I was omitting some very fine examples. The quest for variety made me not dwell too long on any one category, such as a geographical category. Yes, of course, there are other geographical lists, and I can't tell you how many offhand at the moment. I've got all of them in here somewhere in my notes, but I would like to be able to say more about geographical lists. I would like to go back and have a good, any more closed lists? That's another question.
And only the biblical ones closed.
Well, they may be. They may be. Again, I'd need to go and look again at that, and I could do so quite quickly, but I won't waste your time here and now. That may be so. That may be so. There aren't many closed lists, I don't think, as I remember it.
Ted, did you want to come in on that?
No, thank you. Wonderful lecture. Just making the juices flow here.
Good. Thank you, Ted.
Can I make a comment to her?
So we've got Lino.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to make a comment. I thank you, John, for that splendid stylistic analysis of Dante's catalogues. I remember, and I was trying to find the reference. I remember, perhaps you do, a sentence by Benedetto Croce that I remember that it puzzled me when I was a young man, you know, many, many years ago. Actually, it said that catalogue and lists of names and families. I think it is about the list of Florentine families in Paradiso 16. You know, it says are successful insofar as they are poetry as the rest of the text. You know, and you seem to have shown precisely that, the way in which those names, be they families, be they objects, be they animals, be they historical or geographical, the way in which they really are so beautifully and artistically put together by the real master. This is what is so extraordinary, you know. And it also, this reminds me of the musical effect that these names have on also Mandelstam. Do you remember that he compares them to an organ? He doesn't. He compares Dante's catalogues to sort of a kind of fuga, the fugas the Bach now with these names that come one after the other. And it, in a sense, I always, when I spoke to the students, my students, about these names, the students tended to find them rather challenging and sometimes rather tiresome, because you needed to see all the bloody footnotes about each one of them. And I said, enjoy them as sounds, you know, and they are incredibly enjoyable as sounds. But you reminded me of all this, and you did it so beautifully. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, really, that's partly why I took this topic on, I think, because everybody thinks the lists are boring, and I wanted to say myself that perhaps they weren't.
No, I think that Dante had a great fun in actually putting this list together. You know, I'm pretty sure about it, because the way in which he handles them, you know, with an incredible variety of rhetorical figures, you know, and as you have clearly shown, it's quite extraordinary. But thank you again.
Thanks, Lino. Yeah.
Okay, are there other questions there? Hands up. Are there questions in the room?
Can they hear questions?
Well, not from here, but we can. Yeah, but no, Dad, you can say it, and I'll repeat it so people can hear it there. You can say it now.
And then you'll repeat it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's not a question. It was a comment. Thank you for the brilliant. Before, I was actually attending a lecture by Serena Landi, who is a scholar in the UK, who studies the contextuality relationship between Dante and the Gadda.
Mm-hmm.
And one of her main arguments, is that they share Gadda not only appropriates Dante for his own purposes, for literary purposes, but he builds up a structure that is very much similar to the multilinguistic use of Dante. Mm-hmm. And one of the elements that she was focusing on was the list. And so it could be interesting to in your talk, you refer to lists that could have inspired Dante from classical literature and from previous writers, but it could be interesting to actually look at the authors.
I'd be interested in that. Yes.
So Dario's comment is about a lecture he recently went to by Serena Landi, who was looking at has done really wonderful work looking at both Dante and Gadda in the context of the shared poetics, and the listing, this kind of elengazione that both are involved in. So and be interesting to kind of develop this.
She was actually showing a long list of jewelry in the
list of jewelry in Gadda. Yeah.
Which lasted like 3 or 4 pages.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, modern writing, modernism, certainly, Joyce is replete with lists. And, partly there's kind of incantatory function of lists, I think, as well. But the itemization is also, it has something to do with kind of fixing reality as well, I think, within a modernist context. Leila, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Can you come up maybe? I'm conscious of the fact that people who are listening can't hear the questions here, so you speak into the camera.
Hello, everybody. Okay, thank you for this lecture. You touched so many lists or passages in Dante's work that I studied for different reasons. Paradiso 6 for, the history of Rome, also in comparison to other Dante's work, the Convivio and the Monarchia. Of course, Inferno 4, I studied it in comparison to Inferno 5. But we can talk about it later because it's complicated, especially the Aristotle, the philosopher part. My comment, and also possibly question, is about Inferno 24, because I appreciate you talking about the serpents, the Dante's short catalog taken from Lucans. I just want to say that catalogs of serpents were very common in like encyclopedic works in the Middle Ages, and most of them came from Lucan's catalog, because it was the only one to quote, to refer to some of the species that he mentions. But I'd like to point out that what Dante does with the serpents, he acts in the same way, at least I think, then I will ask what you think, with the spices that the phoenix puts into its nest before dying and before it reborns in Ovid. So, in Inferno 24, he's referring both to Lucan and Ovid, like he does then in Inferno 25. So I noticed that he applies the same categories or like rhetoric approach both to Lucan and to Ovid, so to both his sources. Specifically about this thing of the catalog. So Dante, in my opinion, is very brief, very short. You said that too, while the classics are very long. They love long catalogs like Petrarch, for example, in the Triumphi, while Dante was more synthetic. So I think he approaches the classics in this way. He wants to point to his sources, but also to make them like more synthetic. I don't know, because except for Inferno 4, it's true that he makes catalogs, but not the way the classic sources do. They're like big excursus, in the classical. But I don't know, maybe I'm saying too much. That's what I think. So what do you think?
Well, thank you. That suggestion about Ovid is very exciting, something I haven't thought of, and I'm going to look at it straight away. As for Dante's more synthetic approach to catalogue writing, I'm sure that's true. Also because I almost said this, Dante doesn't give all the ancillary information about the snakes because some people anyway, have already read it in Luke, and he doesn't need to give all that. And although that's not the only reason, I think it's the brevity that he's really focusing on there and elsewhere, yes. And certainly a very different approach from those classical writers, and indeed the writer of the Triumphi.
I think that he thought about the Commedia as a hypertext. I mentioned this, you go through other works. Absolutely.
Well, it's a long work, but it's an economical work everywhere, probably in all senses. So it's part of Dante's forma mentis, I think.
Yes,
yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a comment there from Kenneth. Leo Spitzer, celebrated essay on chaotic enumeration. Kenneth, are you there?
I am, and I mean, I was just putting it in the chat. It wasn't really a worked out comment, but it connects back to your point, Dara, about modernism and the condition of modernity being one being enumerative, that God than Joyce are kind of full of detail and full of kind of what seem like sort of a chaotic grouping together of many kinds of everyday things, banal things, and Spitzer was very interested in this kind of question, this kind of problematic aspect of enumeration in which there's a bit of everything. But I am very struck by I am very struck by John's wonderful lecture and by his catalogue of 46, his catalogue of 46 catalogues, which I would rather like, which I'm very interested in, because Blasucci, you'll have obviously been doing all this, but Blasucci has an essay on enumeration in Orlando Furioso, and he says in one section of that, he says, actually, there isn't really that much enumeration in Dante, all things considered, that where you get it, it's sort of energetically kind of disposed on the line, which I think you showed very well. But I get the impression, and I think that the reason for there not being very much work done on enumeration in Dante might well be because of Blasucci's sort of comment about this. So I think that actually it's a very exciting piece of research, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing it when it comes out.
Well, thank you. I must say I had missed the Spitzer essay. I must go and read that straight away now as well. Thank you.
Okay. Now we have 2 more hands up, and then we're going to leave the questions at that. I would just ask the people who are about to ask the questions if they could keep the questions short and say it out loud, because we do have sound issues here in the room, and there's a very heavy air conditioning thing going on in the background. Julia, would you like to ask a question? Do you want to come in, John? Now you're muted, Julia.
I have been editing Brunetto Latino's Tesoro, which of course is an encyclopedia full of lists, which Dante then draws on. And what's interesting is that they both use the name Terence as Terenzio with 2 R's. And then Pietro Alighieri says that his father is using Terence and the comedies for the title of the Commedia. And also the sense of the round Roman theatre. And I love, the snakes, the serpents in Lucan, and the games that Dante is playing. And I see Dante as there because he commits all of the 7 deadly sins. He's the thief, he's the plagiarist at that point, who is plagiarizing Lucan and doing it gloriously.
Yeah.
As nice as it is.
No.
Oh, I speak.
Okay, do you want to?
Yeah. Are you there, Julia? Yes, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. I'm not sure that was really a question. It's an interesting comment. Thank you. And I'll remember that, as many of your other comments I've heard on previous occasions.
Okay, Chris, for Kleinhans.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. That was a wonderful talk. I was thinking in looking at, say, Purgatory 7 with the Valley of the Princes, where we have another type of list. And I've always been struck by the artistic nature of that in terms of looking at a type of almost like a tableau vivant, where you have various figures there in various attitudes, looking at them in profile, as you find in many frescoes of the time. And I was thinking also about about limbo and the various figures from the pagan past and so on, which are then presented in various groups, almost as though it's a type of fresco people seen on a greensward in various groups, looking at them doing things and so on. So I'm thinking about the sort of artistic ramifications of the lists that you have in certain cases in which you have the figures, the souls in a type of landscape rather than simply a listing. In other words, it is a list, but they're also interacting. They're not being just listed but they are doing things in the context of the narrative. It's more of a comment than a question, but any thoughts you have would be appreciated.
Yes, I like that thought. You almost make me wish I had talked about the value of the princes in the list there. But the artistic arrangement, the visual arrangements there, and possible connections even with the visual arts would be well worth exploring. It's something I haven't particularly thought about so far. Thank you. Indeed, yes.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. And thank you for all those questions. I'm sure there are many more, but unlike the last 8 speakers in our series, I'm actually going to take John for a drink. For those of you who might have missed out because of the pandemic, this is what we actually really do after one of these lectures. But just to let you know that our very final lecture of the series is happening next week at the same time, same place, on Zoom, and we won't have any interruptions. And I apologize once again for what happened earlier on. We're going to increase our security, obviously, with the link. Next week's lecture is going to be given by Dr. Valentina Mele, who is going to be talking to us on a not very controversial subject of Dante and Cavalcanti. So that promises to be a great lecture, and I'm really, really looking forward to it because, as many of you know, Valentina has been here with us for a little while. She's one of our postdoctoral fellows, and the input and the energy that she brings to our center is really fantastic. So we're especially looking forward to rounding off our series with Valentina's lecture next week. But please join with me when thanking John once again for a quite extraordinary lecture, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm going to cut off this recording.
Grazie, grazie. Ciao, ciao, grazie, bellissimo, grazie, grazie.